Okay. I'm Angela Pearson, the Director of Research Initiatives and Strategic Planning here at the Gibbs College of Architecture. And this afternoon, it's my sincere pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Joan Ockman. Joan is professor at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. She is also author of one of the most important histories of design pedagogy, Architecture School, 3 Centuries of Educating Architects in North America. She has a long career as a writer, teacher, and critic, dating back to her days as an editor of Oppositions. Our students here at OU know her well as the editor of Architecture.culture, 1943 to 1968, the textbook for our architectural theory and criticism course. Before joining the faculty at Penn, she taught at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation for over 2 decades, where she also served as director of Columbia's Temple Hoyne-Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. She was honored by the American Institute of Architects for her collaborative achievements and named a Fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joan Ockman. Okay. Yeah.
There's the clicker if you need it.
Okay.
And then there's the laser if you need it as well.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your introduction, Angela, and thanks to all the organizers for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here at the University of Oklahoma. It's my first trip to Oklahoma, and to have a chance to see the school of Bruce Goff, both literally and figuratively, firsthand. I also want to congratulate Luca, Stephanie, and Angela on the publication of Renegades, a splendid volume with truly excellent essays, some of which I've had the chance to read online and which I've learned a great deal from. I'm greatly looking forward to seeing the exhibition in a little while. So I'll be talking about the history of architectural education more than its future, but I think we can learn a lot about the present and the future from this history. 10 years ago, in 2010, the ACSA approached me and asked me to propose a project to celebrate the centennial of their founding in 1912. And realizing there was no synoptic history of North American architecture education, I suggested one, little understanding how ambitious and complex this project would turn out to be. First, it's a big continent with a lot of schools, currently close to 140 accredited programs compared to the 10 that existed and met the criteria for accreditation back in 1912. And I wanted to try to give a balanced picture. And second, the archives were, to say the least, spotty. Some schools had kept good records and documentation. Others had almost none, or if they did, they were partial and frequently tended to be anecdotal. Moreover, there were no real models for a book of this kind, even in the European context, where the situation was, if anything, even more fragmentary. It was surprising that architects and architectural educators had spent so little time looking at themselves in the mirror, or seemed to recognize what a revealing barometer the history of architecture education could be for understanding the history of the discipline and the profession, and indeed a wider cultural history. This book should ideally have been a project of many years, but I only had 2. The result is therefore necessarily preliminary and imperfect. But I'm glad to say, with all due modesty, that since its appearance, many scholars have taken up the challenge of writing significant and substantial histories of architecture education, whether focused on single schools or on larger thematic issues. And in an age of digitization and archival expansion, many schools are now beginning to conserve their own history with some care. It's great to see that happening here. So now in thinking about what I might talk on today and what I could contribute to a conference titled Schools of Thought, I decided it might be useful to offer a larger context, both diachronic and synchronic, giving you a sense of some of the diverse history recounted in my book. As I've already suggested, the history of North American architecture education is much more than a matter of Beaux-Arts to Bauhaus and beyond. In particular, the issue of what is specifically or uniquely American about it raises fascinating and important questions. I take it from reading Renegades that the appellation American School, as applied to the pedagogy of Bruce Goff and those around him here in Oklahoma in the mid-20th century, is being adopted from an article published in the Japanese magazine A+U, that was published in that magazine, A+U, in 1981. I worry a little, though, as we use the term ourselves about this nativism. Of course, the idea of an authentic American architecture and architectural culture traces back a long way, especially to Frank Lloyd Wright and his mentor, Louis Sullivan, and it's bound up with claims of originality, individuality, and nonconformity, of democratic idealism and democratic populism, of practicality and pragmatic approaches to problem solving, and also of indigeneity and geography, the latter viewed as a manifest destiny. More broadly, it goes back even further to the American Renaissance movement in the mid-19th century, to thinkers and writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Horatio Greenough, and Walt Whitman, who strove to define a national character and a national culture distinct from that of Europe. Yet these same ideas took on changed and charged meanings over the course of American history under the impact of phenomena like immigration and commercial capitalism, Cold War ideology and the rhetoric of the American century in the mid-20th century, and much else. And as we all know very well, the meaning of America is still evolving today in the context of globalization and a fraught national political landscape. All of this is more than interesting to explore in relation to architecture education. So what I'm going to present here in the remaining time I have is a slide lecture, a lot of images, mostly drawn from my book. And riffing on the conference title, Schools of Thought, I'm titling it Thinking About Schools, American Experiences and Experiments. One more thing, though, by way of preamble. Architecture schools are extremely powerful agents of professional and cultural formation. What a student experiences in architecture school, she tends to carry with her for the rest of her career. At the same time, architecture schools are themselves products of the residual, dominant, and emergent tendencies of their day. They're shaped not just by conservative and progressive forces internal to architecture as an institution, but also by external conditions, from technological changes to economic and demographic transitions to, as we've just said, political currents and world events. Certainly fascinating to think about this in this regard is the interplay between these large structural factors and the appearance every so often of a master architect or a charismatic teacher who rises above but also cannot but channel this background. So apropos of the episode that took place here in Oklahoma 7 decades ago, we might consider the relationship between lines of transmission and lines of flight, between schools of thought and renegades. Okay, so at the beginning, which essentially means the 18th century on the North American continent, apprenticeship, a British model, in Britain sometimes known as pupillage, was the dominant system. It was less regulated and formalized than it was in Britain here, and it was augmented by early drawing schools, like the one you see in this advertisement for a class sponsored by the Carpenter Center in Philadelphia. There were also a few well-to-do gentlemen architects, self-educated, well-traveled, like Thomas Jefferson, who lived in Paris from 1784 to 89 and traveled in Enlightenment philosophical and architectural circles. But in the case of his proposal for the University of Virginia here, we're not dealing with an architecture school per se, but with the idea of a campus as exemplary of a certain kind of community, an ideal community. In other words, architecture as an object lesson. And we'll see more of that in the history. We also see, starting pretty early, books, textbooks that are self-published by people that start to call themselves architects, even if there isn't yet any formalized definition of that profession. And, of course, books are crucial to the transmission of architectural knowledge. But by 1870, with the rise of industrial society and with the Civil War, we see the emergence of a new model becoming dominant in this country. And it's not the Beaux-Arts, not yet. It's the German Polytechnic, a model that's based on science and on research. And architecture at this point is a branch of engineering. It's called architectural engineering. And in the case of Illinois Industrial University, later to become University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, we see a land-grant school. The land-grant schools were established by Abraham Lincoln in 1862 in the first Morrill Act. And we see the land-grant schools becoming among the first to train architects. Illinois Industrial is an interesting case. There's a kind of conflict over priority. What was the first official architecture school in the United States? And the claims go between MIT and Urbana-Champaign, but it depends on whether we're talking about who established the program first or who graduated the first student. In fact, Illinois graduated the first student, and he was the man you see in the middle here, Nathan Ricker, a rather interesting figure who came from a blacksmith background, but after leaving this architecture program, went to Europe and studied in Berlin and came back and would be the head of Illinois' program for more than 20 years. And he was instrumental in establishing the prospectus for the school, and as you could read here, it draws heavily on European models, and not just the Polytechnic, but also the Beaux-Arts. But also we see the beginnings of an emphasis on shop techniques, on hands-on education, and that's something that would be very much emphasized in the context of this school and other land-grant architecture programs that get established soon afterward. So we also see this phenomenon of the experiment station as part of the land-grant model, and what happens at these experiment stations is research. So we get the beginnings of the research model that is certainly back with us today in spades, starting here. And these experimental stations did work on all kinds of topics, from acoustics to materials science to architectural knowledge itself. And Nathan Ricker himself, his own contribution to this was to apply the Dewey Decimal System to the organization of architectural knowledge. So that was yet another brochure that was published by University of Urbana, Illinois Industrial. Here we see a student drawing by Robert Eidlitz at Cornell University. Eidlitz was the nephew of an important architect in New York, Leopold Eidlitz, a German emigre, and here, wood construction details are the subject of his research, and Eidlitz, Leopold Eidlitz, the uncle, had been educated in Prague and in Berlin, and so again, we're starting to see the filtration of European thinking into educational thinking into America, but with differences, with certain modifications. Sorry. Okay. Here you see the drafting room at MIT around the turn of the century. MIT gets founded as a Beaux-Arts institution, despite what you might think from the name. A man named William Ware was the founder, and he quickly brought in Eugène Latang, a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts, to run the design program there. And by this point, the 1890s or so, the Polytechnic model is being superseded by the Beaux-Arts. American architectural students start going to Paris a couple decades earlier, often coming back and founding clubs and their own ateliers. Richard Morris Hunt founded an important one in New York. But this new system quickly eclipses the Polytechnic and will remain dominant for many decades, really through the middle of the 20th century. Here, American students also, as we said, just go to the Beaux-Arts to study and become inducted into all the rituals and practices of this very highly institutionalized system. And in this particular atelier, that of Victor Laloux, this very large man you see sitting in the front row, was a particular atelier that the Americans gravitated to. And but there are also, again, some new ingredients. Another very early graduate of the Paris system was a woman, and that's Julia Morgan, who was admitted to the school in 1898 and was the first woman to graduate in 1902. And she would go back to San Francisco and become the chosen architect of a media magnate there, William Randolph Hearst, and of course have her own practice as well. So women begin to enter the picture and are through this Beaux-Arts system. Sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button. Apropos of the longevity of the system, you can see that from Avery Hall at Columbia University, where William Ware, he who had been at MIT, would go and take the system there, to Paul Cray at the University of Texas in Austin in 1931. There's hardly any difference in the type of drawing and the approach to things, even if maybe the Texas building has more kind of regional and the top one has more of a classical look to it. But essentially this system was a powerful system that was widely adopted and remained in force for years and years. Here you see Louis Kahn, who was educated at the University of Pennsylvania in the Beaux-Arts system of Paul Cray, who 40 years later liked to show that he still remembered and he still could draw an ornament in the Beaux-Arts way. So here he is in the 1960s doing that. Interesting, too, is to see this textbook which was published by a correspondence school, one in Scranton, Pennsylvania, in 1901. By 1910, this correspondence school had more than 1 million students enrolled in it in practical careers in engineering and including architecture. And they published this whole series of textbooks. So for students that could not afford elite universities or couldn't attend school during the daytime because they were working at night, this was another route to becoming an architect. And obviously, interesting to look back on this today as distance learning is again very much part of our picture of what education is becoming or has already. Here we also see other routes into the profession of architecture, like at Hampton Institute, again, right around the turn of the century. African American students working on the interior of a house. And the image below, coming from John Dewey's book, Schools of Tomorrow, 1915, this philosophy of learning by doing, learning by hands-on acquisition of knowledge, somehow also runs very deep in this American setting and distinguishes it from things that we see more or less in Europe, although it's possible also to talk about the Bauhaus workshops and the building of the actual construction sites that Bauhaus students built as part of their pedagogical program. But certainly in the context of the HBCU schools, the first one of which is Tuskegee, founded very early in the 1870s, this becomes a way for students that don't come from privileged backgrounds to acquire professional credentials. We also see some other alternatives or experiments with the dominant system in place in many schools. At the University of Cincinnati, we have this co-op work program where students, as part of their curriculum, were required to spend a certain number of semesters actually working in the field, whether in industry or in an architecture office. And Cincinnati, this would be its sort of signature program, and many future architects that would become notable were educated through this, including, for example, John Haydock, who would end up at Cooper Union. We'll come back to him in a moment when he has a detour in Texas. Also, we see more and more Europeans coming to the United States for the opportunities it afforded, and among the early ones is Richard Neutra, who passes briefly through Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin and then ends up in LA, where he opens a very short-lived school, this one that you see here. It's called he calls it a practical course in modern building art. So practicality is a theme, and for a European who's very interested in American methodologies and technologies like Neutra, one that he very much wanted to be part of. Here he is on the site of the Lovell House, teaching his students, again, some of whom would later on become significant in their own right. Harwell, Hamilton, Harris, and George Ain are the two figures on the right, both of whom would become future educators and significant architects. Of course, Frank Lloyd Wright is the fountainhead. He opens his own school in the 1930s, Taliesin East in this case, or would come east when there's a second branch of it in Arizona. This is in Spring Green, Wisconsin. And so even though Wright professed throughout his career his dislike of schools and continued to attack academies, he had a school of his own, and I think what you see in this photo is that it's very much the master surrounded by his followers. His followers are called apprentices, so picking up on that apprentice system in which he himself was educated in the office of Sullivan and Adler in Chicago. Now his apprentices in this great experiment in working and living as a community here, which also involves building the school itself. Here are the apprentices working on a new wing and a terrace at the school. But Frank Lloyd Wright, who fashions himself as an outsider and someone who has his absolutely nonconformist and individualist approach to things, in certain ways also functions as the charismatic master that all the students around him wish to emulate. At the other end of the spectrum, seemingly, but maybe not so much, is Walter Gropius, who becomes part of a diaspora now in the 1930s of architects who have to escape fascism and end up in the United States at prestigious schools. So Gropius comes in 1937, and here he was handpicked by the dean of the architecture school, a man named Joseph Hudnut, who had already come through Columbia. We're talking a lot about sort of cultural geography here, mapping of the way architecture ideas and educational pedagogical ideas move in a place, and so fascinating to see who's been where and how they converge and so forth. In any case, Hudnut had been at Columbia, and he was brought up to Harvard in order to kind of get rid of the vestiges of the Beaux-Arts system there and implant a more modern system. And he goes to Europe to search for a chair of the GSD, the design program, and he picks Gropius. Gropius comes. You can see there the sort of difference in personas. Hudnut is a rather kind of fusty, old-fashioned looking guy in his tweed jacket, and Gropius is the celebrity, the European sophisticate. And before too long, the two of them didn't get along too well. That you wouldn't be surprised to hear. But in any case, Gropius, again, despite his great charisma, his sort of eminence, preached teamwork and solidarity. And so all the guys, and they are guys here, all are, in a huddle around him, obviously sapping up every word. But he is very much interested in American construction technologies and methods, and Harvard, of course, is a very different setting from the Bauhaus in Germany, whether in Weimar or Dessau or ultimately in Berlin. And so Gropius himself has to adapt. And so when we talk about sort of imported systems and derivative models of architecture education, we also have to be conscious of how those systems were transformed by their entry into the American context. Here's a not so well-known diagram, chart that Gropius makes, illustrating the training and education that will produce architects of authoritative significance. And this is 2 years after he gets to Harvard. And it's really it's interesting to look at this, because clearly what he has in mind is a two-track system. On the left, you have the non-elite system. Everybody starts out, by the way, in kindergarten and nursery school playing. Presumably they're all playing with Froebel blocks and stuff like that. But by the time they grow up, they can enter two different tracks. And on the left, this technical school track will produce architectural assistants and draftsmen, while on the right, we have the university and the liberal arts education and even graduate schools, and out of that we're going to get independent architects and officials. Well, in fact, in a context in which John Dewey's ideas about progressive education and his philosophy has a lot of impact, and as well as other American ideas, this doesn't fly so well, so we don't see too much of this diagram after 1939. Another infusion of Bauhaus ideas comes by way of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who is brought to Chicago by the business community there to set up what he will call the new Bauhaus, American School of Design. It will go through a bunch of name changes as finances have to change as well, and become it becomes the School of Design, and finally will get folded into IIT. And here you see Moholy adapting the famous Bauhaus circles, which is a diagram of the pedagogy that was originally developed by Johannes Itten at the Bauhaus in Weimar, and then when Moholy himself came to the Bauhaus and took over, continued to adapt. But here in Chicago, a different model, and I don't want to, I mean, you could, interesting to put the two diagrams side by side, but also worth mentioning that Moholy had his students take courses at the University of Chicago, where American pragmatist philosophy was very much an important current there, and Charles Morris and some other pragmatist influenced philosophers went sort of back and forth between the schools. Here on the left, we see Moholy in Chicago trying to put into practice something that had always been hoped for in the German context but never quite took off, which was the prototyping of designs that could be put into industry. And Moholy is now patenting his students' design for that purpose out in Chicago, and again, Chicago being a very different kind of place, and this being a businessman's community out there, treated these ideas in a different way, and they had a different reception than they did in Germany. Interesting, apropos of the way world events and transform the architecture education. During World War II, when a lot of architects were sitting on their hands because there was no building to be done, they were in schools and trying to be useful to the war effort. Here's György Kepes, who was a Hungarian compatriot of Moholy. Moholy brought him to the School of Design, having his students work on camouflage projects to, again, aid the military effort that everything is being focused on at that time. Here at Pratt, something similar. A professor named Konrad Foxman having a camouflage laboratory where students, again, are learning how to disguise buildings so they don't get bombed from the air. A third infusion of Bauhaus thought comes through Mies van der Rohe. And again, we have to keep in mind that the Bauhaus isn't one thing. It isn't one idea, as it's so often caricatured, but it was different in its under three different directors in Germany, and it will be different in its different reincarnations in the United States. In fact, the first Bauhaus teacher to get to the United States wasn't Gropius, but Joseph Albers, who went to Black Mountain College in 1932. So he was one of the first to get out. But in any case, Mies also is brought to Chicago to become the head of Armour Institute of Technology, which becomes IIT. And again, we can compare this to the picture that we saw of Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin, or even Gropius at Harvard, kind of surrounded by faithful followers. Mies, in a way, teaches the same way that the the Beaux-Arts master taught by imitation. His students were famously imitating the kind of buildings that he did, and that was their way of learning. Mies also brought his colleagues, people he was close to in Germany and had been at the Bauhaus with him, in this case Ludwig Hilbersheimer. Hilbersheimer, if you know his famous Großstadt architecture from Germany in the 20s, when he's going even further than Le Corbusier's Radiant City to think about a high-rise dense city, comes to the United States and as head of the urban planning program there is thinking of the effects of a hydrogen bomb on cities and the need for dispersal, and working with his students on drawings like this one. So these emigres are certainly bringing new ideas, transforming the situation, but also being transformed themselves. Apropos of buildings as object lessons, we mentioned that, we're talking about Thomas Jefferson. Certainly Crown Hall by Mies, which is not open until 1956, becomes an emblematic image of architecture education in the mid-20th century. And here, looking at the interior, we can note no wires, no wires at all. Pure, clean, and precise and disciplined. That is the philosophy of education that the building itself is projecting. Crown Hall, Mies had started working on the buildings on the IIT campus almost as soon as he got to Chicago in the late 30s, but it's with Crown Hall that opens 20 years later that we get this image that is so powerful in the, let's call it, educational imaginary of architects. The war has its effects, as we have said. Here's a graph that's showing the huge upsurge in enrollment in architecture programs right after the war. The GI Bill enables soldiers to come back and have enter architecture schools for free. And while during the war, because they were absent, interestingly, some new kinds of architectural students were admitted to schools, including women and minorities for the first time. Ann Ting, who would become a partner with Lou Kahn shortly after, was the first woman to graduate from the GSD. Women were not admitted until the wartime. There were also new spatial demands that had to be met. This is late, actually, and up in Canada, but nonetheless, this kind of adaptation, and even just it's a sports facility, a curling rink, but the kind of military psyche was kind of entering into architecture as architecture more and more entered into what would become a military industrial academic complex. And once again, research would be among the kind of forefront concerns of a post-World War II culture. Here you see University of Michigan and Cornell with their research labs, sometimes funded by government, sometimes funded by private corporations like Unistrut for the school building here. Another German emigre, Konrad Foxman, who had in Germany worked on prefabricated wood systems in the 1920s, but was brought with the help of Gropius during the 30s, and would then work with Gropius during the war on this packaged house system, a system of plywood housing. Wood was the only material available at the time. But after that, and after their collaboration ended, would go on to design huge aircraft hangars for the military. But he also taught first in Chicago, now at Illinois Institute of Technology, so this was the part of it that was earlier, the Mahoney School, and then would go out to USC, University of Southern California, and finish his career there. But he said that he preferred working with students in a research educational context rather than within corporations or within the military, because he loved the interchange and the experimental possibilities that he could find in an academic as opposed to military or corporate context. So the academy starts to become a home for various kinds of practices that cannot flourish as well elsewhere. In another context, that's also the same for now Gregory Ain, who I mentioned in that picture of the Lovell House, the Neutra little school, where he is a very left-wing architect out in LA, and now we're in the 1950s and in the McCarthy period, and it's very difficult for him to work, and so he finds a haven at the University of Southern California and can continue to develop ideas about housing, which was his great focus within the school there. Other kinds of teachers, pedagogues, unconventional ones like Buckminster Fuller, who was almost a kind of itinerant educator, somebody who went from school to school to school, had some kind of base in Carbondale, Illinois, but basically kind of taught everywhere, and everywhere he went, he was like a Pied Piper. The students would flock to him, and he was famous for his marathon lectures and these workshops that he did with the students where he had them build actual projects based on his geodesic ideas and others, or here develop ideas for contemporary, innovative, and visionary. That's the one on the right. Uses for his dome. So new kinds of teaching arrangements are also something that we see emerging, and ones that have, in some way, a particularly American cast to them. So certainly that's the case here with Bruce Goff at Oklahoma, and the students who come out of his pedagogical his school here will also go on to have important careers later on, and I don't need to tell you about that because you know so much more, and the marvelous book Renegades is all about this, and I have, Stephanie, appropriated your images here from your chapter where we can see contrasting spreads from a publication that the National Association of Students of Architecture put out in 1956, and the difference, the deep difference between the kind of school that was being formed here and shaped by Bruce Goff and other schools like Harvard, which at this point was doing things that were starting to be attacked as decorated diagrams, as having become extremely formulaic and routine. So what was here was certainly highly original and unique, but Goff didn't come from nowhere either, and you can read all about it in the book, how he got here and started to do what he did. Again, publications are important, and you probably know Perspecta. It's the longest running student architecture publication in America. But we should take note of this one that came out of North Carolina State at Raleigh under the enlightened deanship there of Henry Kamphoefner, who actually came from here in Oklahoma to Raleigh. And they started this journal, which is an extremely interesting one, and surprisingly cosmopolitan. inviting all kinds of contributors from J. Robert Oppenheimer to Albert Einstein to musicians, to bringing all of that, if not in person to the school, at least within this journal, and the students doing that themselves. Again, the building as example, as object lesson. So Matthew Nowicki, a young Polish emigre, comes to Raleigh, brought by Kamphoefner with very strong recommendations from Lewis Mumford to run the school. And he also, while he's there, gets to do this building, the State Fair Arena, opens in 1952. Sadly, he dies in a plane crash the same year, and so that all the new things he had planned to introduce into the curriculum, which especially included very humanistic approach to architecture, were he was not able to implement. He was replaced by Eduardo Catalano, an Argentine architect, very strong commitment to structures, and so kind of coming out of this very virtuoso structure that Nowicki had designed, continuing that line. Meanwhile, another school that Kamphoefner influenced was this one at the University of Texas in Austin, where a very kind of diverse group of people converged around a new dean, Harwell Hamilton Harris. So Harris also, I mentioned, had been on that building site of the Lovell House with Neutra, and then had gone on to have a very impressive career as a designer of modernist houses on the West Coast. Found during the early 50s that work was drying up at a moment when the Korean War was raging, and there were other reasons out there, and decided to become an architectural educator, even though he had no background in that at all. So he comes to Austin and tries to form a faculty there, while encountering the kind of old guard that was entrenched there that were rather resistant to things that were new, but nonetheless, he succeeded in bringing people like John Haydock, the tall guy in the back, and Colin Rowe looking up at the sky in the back, and Robert Slutsky, who was my husband, and Bernard Hosley, who had come from Switzerland by way of Le Corbusier's office. He had worked on the Marseille block there, but decided that he was maybe getting more interested in Frank Lloyd Wright, and so he comes to the United States to look at Frank Lloyd Wright and somehow makes his way to Texas. Anyway, all of these characters kind of converge in Austin, and for a couple of years before they all get fired, come up with a very new program in architectural pedagogy. And the book that you see inset there is written by Alexander Carragon, who had been a student in the program, and but despite his kind of autobiographical connection to this whole episode, writes a very well-documented and detailed history, a beautiful, substantial book telling the story of this program. So I just point that out as an example of a certain kind of scholarship that we want to see more and more of, and his is an early one. But in any case, Harris himself, as I said, is not an educator by background, and really wants a more hands-on approach with his students, and he does that working with 6 students to design this Pacesetter home, sponsored by House Beautiful magazine at the Texas State Fair. It gets built at the fair, ultimately will get bought by a client and moved to another site. But in any case, so that's him. But meanwhile, big ideas, intellectual ideas, formal ideas are being hatched by some of these other so-called Texas Rangers. Here are students in Bob Slutsky's color class. Slutsky, together with Colin Rowe, while they're down there together, write an important essay called Transparency, two-part essay. And here you have these transparency exercises, which actually came out of the color pedagogy of Joseph Albers. And Slutsky had come from Yale, where he had been a student of Albers. So again, all these incredibly circuitous routes and convergences that combine to produce new ideas, new forms of thought, new educational models. Here's some more projects from the program. You see this early 9-square configured house that will later, in its afterlife, end up under John Haydock at Cooper Union as the famous 9-square grid program, but now packaged and becoming very refined from its initial version. So these complex, complicated geography of architecture education is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to have to rush because I see I promised Angela I'd leave 15 minutes for questions. So let me go through some of these other slides quickly. Paul Rudolph, who starts out at Alabama Polytechnic, future Auburn, writing an undergraduate B.Arch thesis called Glass in Architecture and Decoration, will then go to the GSD and become a student at Gropius's, from there down to Sarasota, Florida, and then back up to Yale, where he'll become the dean of the school and in 1958, and also get to do the architecture building there, the A&A building, and again, one of these sort of object lesson buildings, which become definitive for a correction to basically a glass modernist curtain wall architecture, which had been very dominant through Mies and company right after the war, and now a more brutalist, if we can call it that, heavy architecture is one that he's becoming the kind of figurehead for. At Harvard, a new discipline is founded at the end of the 50s by Gropius's successor, Jose Luis Cert, a Spanish architect who also was involved in the international congresses on modern architecture, the SIAM, and involved at this moment in a big altercation with the young post-war generation in Europe, Team 10, and in a sense founds a new discipline at Harvard in order to, as a response to what Team 10 is proposing in Europe, but also because he sees something missing between architecture on the one hand and urban planning on the other. There's a missing in-between scale that he wants to see made into a new discipline known as urban design, and this will be staged very carefully and done in a typically Harvard way. But the masters, here's Le Corbusier on his last trip to the United States, speaking at Columbia. The masters, the old modern masters of the 20s are beginning to disappear from the scene, to die or be too sick to do much, and so opening space for a new generation. Team 10, as I mentioned, is a post-war generation in Europe, but they will find their way into, members of Team 10 will find their way into American schools by the second half of the 1950s and into the 1960s. Here's Otto van Eyck in St. Louis. Otto van Eyck, very interested not just in Mali, the Dogon way of building down there, but also the Pueblo in New Mexico, and we'll spend time looking at that. So also affected by things that he sees. Paolo Soleri, coming from Milan, the Polytechnic there, by way then of Taliesin to found his own place in Arizona, Arco Santi. We're now in the 60s. Of course, the 60s is a whole other kind of moment, an emergence of a counterculture will have a profound effect on architects and architecture students who want to be somehow part of that and who will be anti-establishmentarian in new ways. I know we're going to talk, we'll be talking a lot in this conference about DesignBuild. It gets its start at Yale with the Yale Building Project, and then we'll have a further development. But here you see their very first project in 1967 for the New Zion Community Center. Again, the kind of more anarchic counterculture energies of experimental groups like Ant Farm, who come up with this truckin' university, a mobile, inflatable university. You can think Cedric Price, but now with a more American kind of twist to it, more humorous, more explosive in a certain way, and doing projects like this out in Berkeley. On the other hand, also during this very same 60s moment, the foundation of a think tank in New York City, like the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, a place I had some experience with, founded by Peter Eisenman in 1967. What you should note is that the name, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, the urban studies part of that is the 60s part of it. It was a moment when the city and its problems were front and center, particularly in a city like New York, where all kinds of urban problems were rampant, but a mayor, John Lindsay, really wanted to try to bring the best and brightest minds, architectural minds, to bear on it. And so the Institute, which later becomes more known as a kind of clearinghouse for avant-garde international theory and publications and so on, starts out thinking about housing and thinking about streets and thinking about cities. I'm just going to race here, but of course we can't not mention this studio at Yale in 1968, which was run by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown and Stephen Eisenhower. Bear in mind, we're in 1968, and what the Venturis are choosing to go look at is Las Vegas. All hell is breaking loose in the streets with anti-war demonstrations and racial riots and so on. But the Venturis head for Las Vegas. That in itself is of interest. But apropos of kind of authentic kind of Americanness, who's to say whether, the prairie is more authentically American than the commercial strip in Las Vegas? They both have their American dimensions, and this is what Venturian students set out to find. Others, on the other hand, are much more in the political mix of it, and this building, which was built with the aesthetic that Rudolph had started with his A&A building at Yale, and would lead to Worcester Hall in Berkeley, now decorated with anti-war graffiti in 1970, or at Kent State, we see a very kind of normative, maybe brutalist building that occupied by very kind of disciplined-looking male students in the late 60s, being shocked by events there. So out of the 60s come all kinds of new energies, new movements, new ideals and hopes, and here we see a couple of examples that will end up as movements of one kind or another by the 70s, although the disappointments, the failures to truly transform things is also haunting architecture culture, as we'll see in a second. But from the feminist movement in relation to architecture to the inklings of an environmental movement in architecture, to now a critique by African American leaders like Whitney Young at this AIA convention in 1968, slamming the architectural profession for its irrelevance. These new inputs into architecture education will reverberate although there will be an interruption. So some things have an afterlife, but it goes underground for a while. And before we get to really today and the kind of politics and social ethics ethos that we see among many in our field, comes this, postmodernism. And if we had more time, we would try to think through how this return of the repressed being the Beaux-Arts, resurfaces in the 70s and 80s after the explosive moment of the 60s. Meanwhile, something that doesn't go away is architects' engagement with technology, new technologies, and here you see that whether it's at MIT with the Architecture Machine Group or again back out at Berkeley with computerization, where Christopher Alexander had been an important player a decade earlier, remains a constant thread that surfaces every so often in intense ways in particular locations. And indeed, computer drawing itself, starting perhaps, this is one of the claims to earliness at Ohio State, and then with Greg Lynn at Columbia and his paperless studio producing these kinds of wireframe drawings. And of course we know the story from there into our own moment and beyond, looking to the future of whether it's virtual reality or robotics in schools like SciArc today. We also can't fail to mention the afterlife of the studio trip, which, in '68 could go to Las Vegas, but by the time Rem Koolhaas gets to Harvard in the 90s with his project on the city, we'll go to places like China and Nigeria. And then just one last slide, and I'll stop here so we can have some comments and questions with no particular conclusion. But today, of course, facing this really existential crisis that we hear about so often with the environment and climate change, a whole new infusion of thought and focus is being devoted to issues of ecology and environment in the schools today. So in any case, it's a very diverse picture. We can't sort of boil it down to, again, the Bauhaus and the Beaux-Arts. Much more complicated with certain, I guess we could call them authentically American sort of emergences over the course of this history, and many more to come, even, I suppose, in a global context like the one we have right now. Okay, let me leave it at that, and happy to answer any questions or comments.
Questions for Professor Ockman? Peter has the microphone.
Thank you, Professor Ockman, for that fantastic talk.
Do you want to say? No, I'm fine.
I noticed throughout your presentation, the word research keeps surfacing, and it means something different every time. And that's something we've been wrestling with a lot here. And I wondered if you could reflect on when that word bubbles up, and also, what does it mean today to see it surfacing again?
Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, it's something I really wanted to harp on. It's been almost a hobby horse with me. So, as I suggested, the polytechnical model that starts by the 1870s or so in this country is already connecting architecture to research practices and to the importance of doing research, but in a still scientific engineering context, although not only, as I mentioned, with that organization of knowledge by Nathan Ricker as a form of research. With the Bauhaus, we get a whole new kind of research design research, design as research. And what we were just looking at in the last presentation session with at Pratt, I think is a latter-day kind of version of that, of the rational thinking now applied to processes of design. And so it's correct that it's a very different kind of research, and whether both can be called research in the same way we could debate. But in any case, certainly what we have today is the phenomenon, and I dare say the fetish, of labs, of laboratories. This sort of marquee item in so many schools, curriculums are labs of one kind or another. Everything is a lab, and we could talk about the evolution from ateliers and studios to workshops to laboratories, and the progression that indicates. But in any case, yes, so research is a very important part of a history of architecture education.
Yeah. There's time for one more question. I saw your hand.
Okay, I think I can do it. Thank you for a very interesting history, and I have reviewed the book, so I totally take your challenge of this very, very huge topic and your humility to recognize that more research has to be done. You mentioned the HBCUs and the architecture programs that were cultivated within the HBCUs. But it seems like that's a different book almost to be written. Was there any intersections that you saw in your research across where faculty or alumni from HBCUs entered the PWIs? I mean, keeping in mind that this phrase HBCU is designed in 1960s. Yeah. Before that, these universities didn't think that they were historically black. They were for anyone.
Right.
They were not for blacks only. So
yes,
a little comment on that.
No, and it sounds like you probably know more than I do on a really fine-grained history of this. I think there were some figures that went back and forth between the sort of marginalized schools that were set aside for those minority students, and then the elite universities. Booker T. Washington has a different approach from who am I? Yes. Du Bois. So, that history too is a complex history, and it does need to be told well.
I'm hoping ACSA is not going to take another 100 years to get that chapter written.
Yeah.